and experts in the area of design and implementation of coastal structures. Two speakers today that we're really privileged to have are Robbins and Dan Stapleton. Greg are both with GZA GeoEnvironmental Incorporated, and they're both registered professional engineers. Greg is project manager with the Marine Waterfront Technical Practice of GZA GeoEnvironmental, and is a senior principal and senior VP of GZA Environmental Incorporated and the leader of their water services group. Dan has a BS in civil engineering and his experience, Greg has a BS in civil engineering and his experience includes project evaluation and implementation from the perspectives of a regulator, owner, and consulting engineer. He's been responsible for the repair and reconstruction of thousands of feet of bulkheads, stone revetment, and seawall. Dan has degrees in the geosciences, civil, geotechnical, and ocean engineering, and he heads up GZA's Hazard Risk Management and Climate Change Services Group, efforts to reevaluate the external flow hazards of municipalities, states, and critical infrastructure. We're going to speak today on the role of hard coastal structures in climate change adaptation and coastal resilience. And with that, I'll turn it over to Greg and Dan for today's webinar. We'll also mention that if you have questions along the way, use the Q&A or the chat function. And if you address them to me, Tom Sheehan, I will read those at the Q&A. We'll also have a chance for people to unmute and also ask in person if they would like to. So again, I'll turn it over to Greg and Dan, and thanks, guys, for being here today.
Thank you. This is Dan Stapleton, and as introduction, I'm here with my partner, Greg Robbins, and the topic of our talk is the role of hard structures in climate change adaptation and coastal resilience. And I wanted to start with a little bit of an introductory statement here, and this is out of Army Corps of Engineers guidance. And I'll read it and then kind of hit a few salient points here. Coastal systems are composed of natural and built features and their socioeconomic context. The buildings of the system include nature-based features and structures that support a wide range of objectives, including erosion control and storm risk reduction, as well as infrastructure providing economic and social functions. The relationships and interactions among natural and built features determine coastal vulnerability, reliability, risk, and resilience. And I've highlighted some of the key components of this, which are really integrating natural and built features. Built means man-made features, structures. But these features only exist in some form of socioeconomic context. So there's costs associated to it, there's property ownership, there's potential losses. So all of these effects, there's access to natural resources, there's recreational benefits. So all of these things get bundled up in a broad socioeconomic context, and natural and built features have to be designed to support that. You have physical benefits, so erosion control and storm risk reduction. We'll talk a lot about that today. They also have economic and social functions, and each of these are equal. So it's a balance of the physical benefits we get as well as the economic and social benefits we get. And in this statement, though, is conflict, and that sort of lies the rub. There's conflict between the benefits of a built environment versus a natural environment. There's conflict between hard structures, which really form to fix the coastline, to stabilize the coastline, versus natural features which are really exist in a very dynamic environment. So it's these conflicts that make the coastal resiliency so challenging, and the effects of these challenges is going to increase with climate change. So let's look at typical New England shoreline. This is New Haven, Connecticut, which is on Long Island Sound. Typical of a lot of New England shorelines, this is a highly built environment. What you're looking at in the image there is New Haven Harbor. New Haven Harbor is a very large harbor. It's about 2 miles in extent from the mouth at Long Island Sound to the Long Wharf area in downtown New Haven. And it's highly built. It's got a lot of property, homes, critical infrastructure, industry, commerce, ports, harbors. It also has some elements of some natural environments, and you can see on the slide here, I actually refer to it as natural/built because there's very few pure natural environments left in a lot of the New England coastline. But the rivers and streams, estuaries, wetlands, tidal marshes, beaches, and as you move farther southward towards Long Island Sound, you get barrier beaches. If you look at New Haven, what you see here, this is the National Flood Insurance Program flood rate map, and what you see in blue reflects the extent of coastal flooding. Extent of coastal flooding associated with what's called a base flood elevation, which is a 1% annual recurrent flood. Point for takeaway here is this concept of probability. The 1% annual exceedance recurrence interval flood really means that in any given year, that's the flood that's going to be met or exceeded within 100 chance. So it's purely statistical, probabilistic risk. But here, it's quite vulnerable, and it's vulnerable to coastal flooding, and that includes potential for property loss, homes lost or people relocating, critical infrastructure damages, and so forth. Damages associated and risks associated with the natural environment. This is particularly true when you introduce effects of climate change. So what we're experiencing in New England are certainly sea level rise. I think most people are quite aware of that. But you have to be aware of changes to the water quality in terms of effects on salinity, effects on pH change, erosion and migration of both beaches and potential wetlands. All these have effects to the ecology and the wetland quality. So, approach creating resilience in that type of environment. Significant coastal flood risk, a highly built environment, some components of natural features, and a very significant vulnerability and risk due to coastal flooding. And that risk is going to increase with sea level rise. So this is an image out of guidance documents prepared by the Army Corps of Engineers, and I think it's a very good illustration. If you look on the right-hand side, you see a series of elements ranging from, in the dark gray, it's structures, in the green, it's natural, in the green and gray, it's nature-based features, in the orange, it's really non-structural measures such as acquisition, relocation, building, retrofit, so forth. So when we look at resilience, we look at basically three strategies. And you can use one, two, or all three of these when you're doing resiliency planning at the municipal scale. And these strategies include retreat, accommodate, and protect. So retreat means you basically let nature over, you acquire property and relocate that property. And a situation in New England where we would see a retreat would be a barrier beach, which was lightly developed, and municipality would come in and acquire those properties, demolish them, convert the barrier beach to public space, and then for the most part let the natural dynamics of coastal processes take over. The concept of this plan, though, what this picture is really intended to indicate is you can integrate each measures. So a strategy. So I mentioned retreat. Accommodate is to allow flooding to occur, but take measures to mitigate the effects of that flooding. So that benefits, such like raising buildings, it's changes to policies and regulations, it's enhanced flood warning and evacuation. So you're still allowing flooding to occur, but you're taking measures to minimize the effects of that. Protect really keeps the flood waters out. So what you're doing is creating typically structures that will prevent flooding from coming into the built environment. And look at this image here. What it's really intended to show is an integration of each of the elements as part of a broad resiliency plan. And so when you're on the more seaward extent, close to shoreline, you tend to have more natural and nature-based features, and as you encroach to the highly developed built areas, you tend to rely more on structures. The overall kind of accepted approach to resiliency planning, and obviously we're going to focus on the structural elements of this. To go through a quick tour of different categories of structures. I'm starting with the very large ones to sort of the very small ones, just to give you an overview, and then we'll give you some specific examples. So storm surge barriers. So these are very, very large structures. Their primary purpose is coastal storm damage reduction. These cost in the order of hundreds of millions to perhaps over $1 billion. For those of you who are calling from the Boston area, you may have read in the Boston Globe over the last months articles about the concept of creating a storm surge barrier bridging the harbor islands to protect all of Boston Harbor and the built-up areas of Boston. They're very expensive structures. They are very large scale, which means the federal government is probably going to be involved in the capital investment. They're typically beyond what a municipality could do. They're also not, they have a lot of negative components to it, and by far the most negative component is effects on water circulation, the barrier, and in the Netherlands, which have used storm barriers extensively, found over the last couple of decades the effects of that circulation on water quality and ecology. Here's a of an actual storm surge barrier. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. Providence is at the northern end of Narragansett Bay, which is a very large estuary, which is connected to the Atlantic Ocean. Providence experienced flooding, extensive flooding during the 1938 hurricane and 1954 hurricane, and this flood barrier was constructed, I think, in like the late 50s after the 54 hurricane. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see, again, a FEMA flood rate map. The light blue indicates the extent of coastal flooding. The sort of tan gray stipple shading reflects areas effectively protected by that levee. And the red and blue shading reflect riverine flooding. So common to a lot of geomorphologic settings in New England, we have an estuary, and we have several watersheds and river systems that discharge into that estuary. So when you look at the use of the surge barrier as it's used in Providence, but this is very common, you are creating the barrier to keep the coastal flooding out, but you now have to contend with all the runoff and rainfall and runoff coming down through the watersheds and river systems. So this barrier operates with a series of very, very large pumps that pump water from the area, the barrier, out into the into Narragansett Bay, and then those gates close to protect the coastal storm surge from encroaching. This has been a very successful structure in terms of flood protection for Providence over the last 40 years, but kind of a lesson learned, it is now challenged due to sea level rise, and it's at the point where these floodgates have to be closed even during very high astronomical tides. So the cost to replace this and deal with sea level rise over the next 20, 30, 40 years is going to be significant. The breakwaters, these are concrete or natural quarry stone structures, and in this is actually the Port of Galilee in Rhode Island, and the Atlantic Ocean out in the background. And if you look in the background, you can see a series of two breakwaters. And these waters serve a couple of functions. Basically, they reduce wave action, so they're protecting, sheltering from large storm waves. And this area you can get 20, 30 or larger storm waves during major storm events. They also serve to create an inlet and stabilize an inlet coming into the port. And in these breakwaters form an almost continuous circular protection system, which forms a harbor of refuge. And I'll show the breakwaters right here. This is the inlet. This is the protected harbor. This is the harbor of refuge. Docks and bulkheads, these are vertical structures, as you can see here. And their primary function is to provide waterfront access. So obviously this is a small dock for accessing for fishing, purposes of fishing, getting to your boat. This is a larger dock. This is Davisville, Rhode Island. So this is a vertical bulkhead primarily for vessel mooring and commercial unloading of this vessel. It's a container vessel. Just a bulkhead under construction. These can be stone, quarry stone, but more often they're going to be sheet piled, either a steel sheet pile or a plastic sheet pile. Again, the primary purpose of these is to provide waterfront access. A little bit closer to the shoreline and starting to integrate a little bit more with natural and nature-based features. The seawalls, and their purpose is to, again, to provide waterfront access, as you can see here, but to provide a high degree of flood protection. So on the left side, you can see no seawall. You can see the effects of erosion and flooding. Without the seawall, with the seawall, you can see waterfront access. You can see flood protection, and in fact, this rounded tip here is to attenuate wave overtopping. Moving a little bit the same concept as seawalls, we have revetments, and these are, again, concrete or natural quarry stone, but their purpose is shoreline protection. So you take a highly erodible shore and use, again, the concrete or natural stone to stabilize that shore. These are some images of and seawalls. This is the actual an existing seawall combination revetment. That revetment, it's a pretty robust revetment, but also protects power at the seawall. Here you can see a seawall repair under construction to give you a little bit of sense of that. Some images of revetments on the left-hand side. This is about as big as a revetment as you're probably ever going to see. This thing is absolutely massive. You can see the equipment and scale. So this is a natural bedrock outcrop peninsula. This is a very, very large revetment constructed on that for purposes of flood protection and sheltering this harbor in Rockport, Mass. On the right-hand side, we have these two images, which are really getting a little bit closer to this concept of integrating with natural and nature-based features. And these represent is a revetment, so rock revetment. It's fairly robust. It has been covered and buried with a stabilized planted dune. So the idea for this is, for most of the time, most normal conditions, the revetment exists outside of the limits of the normal coastal processes. But for you to get a very large flood event, let's say behind this revetment you had utilities or property that needed to be protected, that revetment would serve as that shoreline flood protection during a extreme storm event. Our groins, which are similar in construction to breakwaters, but they serve a very different purpose. They're built perpendicular to the shoreline, and their intention is really just to trap sand and migrates with long shore transport. And you can see trap the sand. They're often accompanied with offshore breakwaters that run parallel to the shoreline. These really are quite common in the Mid-Atlantic. They're fairly common in, they get less common as you move north. They also really fallen out of favor for a lot of reasons. They completely disrupt the natural processes of each shoreline. And also, if you're trapping sand to protect your beach, you're taking that sand away from somewhere else. So they are very common. It's crucial to try and instigate removing them, but they are not looked at favorably from a regulatory perspective, and they're sort of falling out of favor, and right so. Lead flood walls, these really serve the purpose of primarily just flood protection. Can exist in a riverine environment, or they can exist in a coastal environment, but also provide waterfront access. And in a lot of the resiliency we work for England municipalities, what we attempt to do is greenways, which were already often planned municipality, the geometry and modification to the geometry of those greenways and turn them into a flood protection. That's kind of a win-win situation. On the right side up here, you can see a small lake here. This is in Jacksonville, is Lake Okeechobee. This is a very large coastal lake. Down here, we see different combinations of kind of a low seawall to but a wetlands, keeping overtopping from that to a sort of significant structural seawall with glass element to increase the level of flood protection. Now really down to a very sort of sheltered environment and getting much greater integration with natural and nature-based features. These are sills, which are very small breakwaters intended to trap sediment and attenuate waves in order to get wetland growth. Here's some elements for these. Are called these are serve a submerged breakwater, but also to encourage marine life, in particular oysters. That's very common in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and other buried revetment dune / planted dune. We're placed in an urban environment, and this is almost all about flood protection and access to water and enhancing economic development. This is out of the big project, proposed image out of the Big U project in Manhattan. And on the left-hand side, you can see a normal condition. So you have a developed park area. This really serves as a levee, and under floods, you can see this portion of it is flooded, and what you're left with is a flood protection levee for protection of inland areas. Different version of that, but using deployed temporary measures is also become quite common. So these temporary measures are used purely for flood protection. They're only during the period of and then they could be removed, and you just have an heated slot. Get sort of into the trying to bring in sort of an artificial / natural environment into an urban setting. A lot of creative options. These often a flood protection component, but when they're associated with green infrastructure for managing stormwater, and they have a obvious recreational and benefit. So that's a very quick overview of the different categories of structures. Talk how to an integrated approach to coastal resiliency by blending these structures. There's a lot of guidance out there, and I've just highlighted some of it, but the majority of it, well, not the majority, but there's very, very good guidance developed by NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers. Advancements that have been made in the last couple of years have been understanding from an engineering and a physical stress perspective on how to integrate these with natural systems. So that's where a lot of this guidance is headed. And when we consider that, when you try and integrate these systems, system components are suitable for different purposes. So very robust environment where you have large waves or significant floods and all the forces that are associated with that, you tend to a structure where you have a more sheltered condition with smaller waves, a less active environment. You can start to couple together to natural and systems like beaches and wetlands. It's really just a function of these physical components, the reach, which is the distance that sets the wave up. This is the reach, this is the fetch, which will affect what types of marsh and wetland vegetation you can do. Storm surge, which is water level that's going to exist intermittently during the storm, and in particular wave heights, because wave heights come with currents and wave effects that can negatively impact structures. Is real distance that the wind can travel over unimpeded water, and so waves are created by frictional resistance of wind on water. So if you have a very long fetch of, say, 5-10 miles, you can get very large waves. If you have a very small fetch of a few hundred feet, maybe out to or so, you really can limit the maximum size that waves can get. And it can limit the wave energy that you can support use of natural nature-based features like wetlands that might be eroded or negatively affected due to waves. So just out of that guidance documents that I referenced, here is a table that indicates sort of suitability, different features, and the costs associated with these features. So living shorelines, which are integration of structures and wetlands, so it's typically a tidal flat with a submerged breakwater or a natural reef, and then moving into a backwater with wetlands and then into a beach environment. That's a living shoreline. It's really suitable where you have a low energy environment. Beach management, again, a low to moderate, generally small waves, small fetch. If you get significant wave heights, you start to get into erosion beaches. Then we look at structures. These can support much larger, much energy environments with large waves, larger fetches, and steeper coasts. Obviously, the price goes up significantly as you go into different types of structures, and these are revetments and bulkheads and seawalls. These are all very robust physical environments, higher cost. Nature-based features are much more sheltered environments, lower energy, and typically lower costs. Just a couple of slides here before we go into examples. These are really whole talks in themselves, but I want you to at least to hear so you can kind of be aware of it. Everything we do in the coastal business now is done what's called informed decision making, and this is a process developed by the Army Corps of Engineers and others, and it's how we select what the appropriate levels of protection are and how we determine what types of energy need to be supported by each of these elements, whether they're natural and nature-based features or structures. The concept here is really one of probability. So I mentioned before the FEMA 100-year period flood, that is a probability that a certain event will occur. Each of these has a different chance of occurrence, so we look at the consequences of each one of these events also in terms of a probability. So enough said on that, but the takeaway here is we really look at the structures from the perspective of probability into a benefit cost analysis. The other thing that I want to mention here as a takeaway is that For the most part, the standard practice now is to use numerical modeling. These are computer models that simulate floods, circulation, riverine flow, waves, erosion, and the effects. So we really look at things probabilistically, and we look at things using numerical models. So just examples here. I'm going to go through a couple of quick ones and then hand it over to Greg. This is a project we're working on back in New Haven. This is the Long Wharf area of New Haven. This is Route 95 for those of you who may have driven down here. This is Long Wharf itself, which is wetlands down here. It's got some bulkheads. This is a new boathouse that's being constructed. Then we have a fairly highly developed area behind Long Wharf. This is a station with Amtrak and Metro North. Here we have some commercial development. We have some industrial development here. So again, this is a FEMA flood map. So you can see the area is highly vulnerable to flooding. This project was first to look at alternatives for flood protection, and secondly, to look at what kind of economic development and socioeconomic benefit we can make from that flood protection. So an approach that is a living shoreline approach, and moving from the seaward to landward, this is an area which is already a large tidal flat. So this is very shallow water. This is the Long Wharf Pier. This is a dredged area, and the commercial channel is out here. The navigation channel is out here. Basically, this gated system, which goes from the submerged oyster castles. These act as submerged breakwaters. They have an ecological benefit, but their physical benefit is to attenuate wave action. To restoration. So now we've knocked the waves down a little bit. At the tidal flat, we've got these submerged oyster castles. To planting low and high marsh wetlands. This is already a wetland developed area, and to this we put a sill, which is one of the rip sill along here to stabilize these wetlands. We move further inland. We go into a partially buried revetment, so now we're starting to move into a bit of shoreline protection and flood protection during an extreme storm event. Some nourishment with a planted dune, and then a seawall. So basically, if you look at that section here, we have the sill, we have new wetlands, we have revetment, we have some planted dunes, and as you move in, we have a seawall. And if you look down at these blue, you can see the different return period floods. So this is protected against that 100-year return period event. But during normal conditions, say tidal conditions, this revetment is outside of the normal range of coastal processes. But this, along with the seawall, protects. This is a major sanitary force main, this road, and then ultimately all those flooded areas inland from Long Wharf get protected. And this is a concept drawing of what this could look like. So in addition to providing legit flood protection, it has an obvious benefit as becoming a destination, a sort of natural / built environment, access to water, and sort of a win-win from perspective. Still providing a very real in terms of flood protection. The open ocean environment, this is in Long Branch, New Jersey. This is not a job that GA worked on, but I think it's an excellent example. We're now in a much more robust environment. This is open to the entire Atlantic Ocean. And you see this is an integration of several components, from a beach, a buried revetment, to a planted dune. You can't see here, but there's a sheet pile bulkhead. So if this were all eroded, this would still be stable. You have your boardwalk, and you have developed areas up here. So you have access to the water, you have significant shoreline protection during extreme events, and then you have natural benefit from a planted dune, and you have the beach itself, which has significant tourism value and shore protection value. Look at designing these types of systems. You have a lot of questions. How big should they be? How robust should they be? How much will they cost? What kind of beach nourishment are you going to need? So on and so forth. This is that under construction. You can see this is a replacement of the boardwalk. These are timber piles. Here's seating. Here's the dunes under construction. Here's the third revetment. And then you have beach nourishment. This was a major beach nourishment project. It was taking place before and during and after Hurricane Sandy. And put that in the perspective, again, of risk and probability. So here's a terror event. This is, so now you're down in the tidal condition here. Here, 1 in 100 chance of occurrence in any given year. 1 in 500 chance. So this actually provides a lot of risk reduction in terms of flooding and the effects of sea level rise to increase these water levels to some probability of occurrence, but an increased water level to sea level rise. I'm going to head over to Greg to kind of bring us back into reality here and go into sort of the real challenges on projects.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about how hard structures become the primary solution. Dan's talked a little bit about incorporated into natural and nature-based systems, which is really something we see a lot more of now than standalone hard structures. And so as I'll present a case where a hard structure was selected as the primary solution, we'll review how that decision was reached, what some of the considerations were, and why a hard structure was chosen. Looking at a community in Massachusetts, Marshfield, Massachusetts. It's southeast of Boston. It's a suburban community that was originally developed by from the city of Boston, who could obtain cheap land out of water. They would build summer cottages, and they could come out and escape the heat from the city. What were summer cottages are now year-round residences. It's very high land, and what's allowed that change, or part of what's allowed that change to occur, was in the 1930s, the WBA projects involved a lot of seawall construction in this area. And what it did was it stabilized the shoreline and afforded the property by seawall with a significant level of protection from coastal storms. As you can see in these photos, the reach of the area that we're discussing is predominantly northeast facing and has an unlimited fetch. The types of storms that generally impact this area, monster tropical storms that do generate northeast waves, but they tend to move through very quickly. If they occur high tide, it can be substantial coastal issues. If it's at a low tide, it's a little bit more limited. What more often and tend to have more concern about are the northeast storms, or nor'easters as they are here. They tend to sit offshore for a period of more tide cycles, up to 1 or more days, and can see substantial coastal erosion in those conditions. So these structures that were constructed in the 1930s, as you can imagine, now we're looking at some pretty well-aged infrastructure that's in need of maintenance and repair. This particular community in the 1990s began a systemic approach to replacing and repairing its seawalls. This was partially made possible by the fact that the state was providing matching grants for these types of projects, and it allowed the town to move forward without a whole lot of internal discussion about it. It was viewed as sort of a public works project where seawalls had some issues, they needed to be maintained or rebuilt, and they were. Unfortunately, this grant program left, and the substantial cost of maintaining these seawalls meant that the town wasn't able to approach the program the same way they had in the past. So what happened, what we're going to focus on here is an issue that occurred in 2010. I'm going to take a quick step back. The question that we had asked earlier, why would a hard structure become our primary solution? The reality is, and what we tend to face, is that these structures already exist. They're structures that were built at some point in the past. There was a significant amount of development that occurred behind them. They now are in need of repair and maintenance, and some decisions have to be made about how to do that. This is the seawall that we're discussing from the town of Marshfield. When these projects now, decisions have to be made by the communities that are responsible for them is what to do. Do they spend the time and the money to project or these seawalls? Do they retreat? Should a natural approach be adopted? Some is feasible. Unfortunately, in this instance, you can see from the coastline that we're dealing with, it may not be the most feasible. There's not a lot of protection to allow a natural or nature-based solution to thrive. So the questions become, how do they maintain the seawalls? How do you adapt the seawalls to address future needs and for future conditions with sea level rise and other protection needs? A view of the area that we're discussing. There's approximately 5,500 feet of existing seawall. You can see this area here. It is a beach. This barrier beach would typically move landward. It's the natural process. So you'd have a protected salt marsh behind it, and overwash would attenuate waves and allow that barrier beach to migrate landward until it hit something a little bit more substantial. In this, the barrier beach was armored, and once armored, a lot more development could occur. And one of the unique features that we have in this particular area is the existence of a polder of the seawall. If we move to the next slide, you can see the area in blue is an area that would be tidal if not for, in the area of the yellow bar at the across the Green Harbor River here, a dike was built in the late 1800s. It was built specifically to tidal influence on this area. Farmers were looking for more land in order to graze their animals, so they built the dike. It was not met with a lot of support from the fishing community, who felt that it really impacted their harbor and siltation issues, and became a point of local contention to the point where fisherman was stopped on his way to the dike with a wheelbarrow full of dynamite at one point. So we're left with the structure. We're left with the area in blue that you see that would be tidal if it weren't there. When you start at the seawall and move landward, you're actually moving downhill. And so all of the area in blue at the upper reaches of the tide cycle are below ocean elevation. This is protected by the seawall, by the dike. But were that seawall to breach, one of the things that needs to be considered is how it would impact all of this infrastructure, which includes it's 100+ homes. That's the number of homes directly behind the seawall. But in this area, the number goes up astronomically. But there's also a municipal airport, substantial ecological and substantial infrastructure. If we get into the actual of the structure was addressed, I want to talk about something that occurred that's brought all of this to a head. In 2010, the town had decided to replace, and I'm going to go, to replace the northern section of this seawall. Shortly after the existing condition survey was completed, a 450-foot section of the seawall fell over. This was due to a drop in the beach elevation in front of the seawall. Unfortunately, the drop in the beach elevation was a direct result of hard structures. If you look to the north of the project area, which is highlighted in blue, you'll see 4 arrows. Those arrows identify 4 coastal banks that historically were the eroding source of sediment, which will supply the beaches in our area. The sediment transport in this area is predominantly to the south. These large coastal banks would erode and feed the beaches in this area. Unfortunately, these four banks, aptly named First, Second, Third, and Fourth Cliff, are now almost completely armored. The picture in the lower right corner shows you Third Cliff looks like today. There's no erosion occurring at that location. These sediment sources heavily armored, and the sediment transport continuing to the south. What we experience is a change in the beach profile, a lowering of the beach profile, lowering of the beach elevation, and as a result, the toe of the seawall in the area that we're discussing became exposed, and 450 feet of the seawall fell seaward. Additional 165 feet fell over shortly after construction on a repair of this particular seawall. One thing that that became apparent to the community when they dealt with the seawall that fell over was that because it was such a high-profile event with the collapse, there was a lot of media coverage. The grant program had stopped, so the town was looking to have to, one, address the issue immediately, perform some emergency repairs, but also address the collapsed seawall, and the funding was going to be a significant issue. And because of the high cost of this project, there was a significant public debate that began. The question that a lot of people had was, why should we do anything? Should we retreat? Should we just abandon this seawall, leave the property owners behind it to fend for themselves? This was actually a pretty strong opinion by some. Others recognized the need or the responsibility to maintain the infrastructure and to maintain the seawall because of the development that had occurred behind it, and because the town itself had significant resources into roads, water, sewer, gas, and access to certain parts of the community. So, in addition to the cost discussion, is who's going to pay for it if we're going to do it? And then there was a discussion locally about who would benefit from it, whether or not the people directly behind the seawall needed to pay a greater share of the cost than the town as a whole. Betterments were discussed. Betterments are a means to fund certain infrastructure projects that have direct benefit to a limited number of residents. Typically, you would see that with a sewer expansion project, where people that are on the sewer expansion fund a higher percentage of the cost than the overall general public in that area. Benefits were looked at here. The polder became a contributing factor in making that a difficult discussion, because the question became how far to go, and who's receiving the direct benefit. Because this is a polder area, and because the seawall failed, you saw significant erosion behind the seawall. How would it impact properties moving back some distance? A lot of discussion among the residents in the town of sea level rise, whether or not the town had a comprehensive townwide sea level rise response, whether or not they need to. In the end, they did decide to reconstruct this project. So, decide to project like this, then the questions become a little bit more technical, and that is, how do we adapt the structure in order to address future needs, and how to avoid the problems that were experienced in the past. One of the ways that to accomplish this is to raise the top. Raising the top is going to reduce overtopping. It's going to minimize flooding. To raise the top was something we had to look at from both an aesthetic perspective, but also from an engineering perspective. Homes behind the seawall were going to experience a reduction in views. They were going to have a more difficult time accessing the beach on the front of the seawall, and that became a political decision. But then there was the need to look at the engineering behind the overtopping and what that would mean for the properties located landward. one of the things we were able to do is look at how different elevations of the seawall would impact FEMA flood zones. By reducing the flood zone rating, then the insurance premiums that are paid by the properties behind the seawall would go down. So there's an analysis that needed to occur about how high to raise the wall versus the actual net benefit of reduction in insurance premiums. In addition to going higher, there was a desire to go deeper as well. This was stemmed by the concern about the beaches continuing to drop and wanting to prevent a recurrence of the collapse that had happened that led to this project. Now, going higher and by going deeper, that raised some geotechnical concerns. This, as we mentioned before, this is constructed on a barrier beach. And because barrier beaches migrate landward over the protected salt marsh behind, there's typically a large amount of marine deposits underneath the barrier beach, in addition to, in this case, a peat layer. It was a 2 or 3 foot thick peat layer that was the remnants of the salt marsh. And so in order to make sure that the existing ground surface was going to be able to support the weight of the larger seawall, a footing was added, and this footing was constructed in order to spread the forces out more evenly and approximate the structure on the soil. Groins, you can see groins in this picture. There were groins in the existing seawall. Unfortunately, the groins had deteriorated to such a point that they no longer were doing anything. Because of that, it was going to be very difficult to re-permit those groins. And as Dan mentioned, groins are something that are frowned upon now unless you are committed to a substantial beach nourishment program to go with them. The loss of the beach was a substantial issue for this community, and they really wanted to protect the toe of the seawall by installing a revetment. Unfortunately, the regulatory community was much more interested, or is much more interested, in seeing a beach nourishment approach taken to maintaining beach levels. The considerations that come into play are hard versus soft, whether or not you're impacting the use of the beach, how much of the beach you're taking up with your hard structure, towns concerned with the effectiveness of it, what's going to happen when there's a storm. You can have your beach go away overnight, literally overnight, with one big storm, and if the beach drops below the elevation of the seawall, then they're concerned about seeing that seawall come down again. So they're very interested in having the revetment installed. The regulatory community understands that, but is also very interested in the beach treatment aspect, and so right now there's a set analysis going on along this entire reach of beach to determine what the best beach nourishment approach is going to be.
And I think pretty much kind of wraps up. We threw a lot of information at you, but I'm open for questions. And I think the last history really speaks to a lot of the realities of trying to do this. In particular, to try and bring in natural and nature-based features combined with structures in a highly built and developed area. And one thing Greg didn't mention is the cost of beach nourishment, which in the New Jersey example, New Jersey spent over the last few years about $1 billion on beach nourishment. They plan to spend another $1 billion by 2050. It has to be supported by tourism, and when you come up to an area like this, we don't have that tourism return to support beaches.
Guys, thank you so much. We are rapidly running out of time. We only have a couple of minutes. And so what I might do is I have one question, and then maybe, if you don't mind, maybe if people have specific questions, maybe they can contact you via email. So if you're okay with that, maybe you can just quickly leave your email address at the end here. But thank you so much. My question I wanted to ask, for the benefit of those particularly from our project or from our network, is, do you feel as though there is enough designs and information or standards on site characterization and design of these structures that's out there? or much of the design really based on a lot of experience and just the collaborative efforts from the different disciplines that are contributing to the project development?
Over the last, there's been a significant transition in the industry from, it might have been a little bit more empirical based to something that is very, has a rational in design and engineering. And to do good engineering on this, you need good environmental data, and that can be very expensive to collect. By that I mean, in terms of probability, what kind of water levels you can experience, what kind of wave heights you can experience, and what is the relative probability of those. We are fortunate in the Northeast here to have access to a number of publicly available studies, in particular the Army Corps of Engineers North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, where you can have that information made available to you. And there's also a lot of gauge data, either wind buoy data or water level gauge data. So there's a very robust amount of information right now to do very high-end engineering. So I would say all the work we do is in the context of risk-informed decision-making, and it is all supported by a lot of high-quality environmental loading data.
Great. I apologize for having to end, but we're at the 2 o'clock time at this point. Do you mind sharing your email address in case some of the attendees have questions?
No, not at all. It is on. Let me just right here.
I'll give you mine while Dan's trying to get it typed on the screen. Mine is Gregory.Robbins, Robbins, @gza.com. And Dan's, but he's working to get it on the screen. Dan's is Stapleton @gza.com.
That was a terrifically informative webinar for especially many of us that aren't experts in this area. So thank you so much for bringing us all through from the inputs to the resulting designs. That was a great overview, and we appreciate it. Just mention to those that attended that these are posted on the project website, which is resilientinfrastructure.org. So this webinar, with appreciation to Greg and Dan, has been recorded and will be posted there shortly. And I want to remind you that our next webinar is going to be from Dr. Dave Kriebel from the United States Naval Academy. He's going to be talking on April 12th at 12:15, also on webinar format, on coastal engineering principles, design inputs for coastal adaptation. So we're going to go a little bit backwards next time and go back to some of the design inputs based on the ocean engineering principles that touched upon earlier in the talk. So again, thank you to Dan Stapleton and Greg Robbins from GZA GeoEnvironmental for speaking today, and thanks to all of you for attending this webinar sponsored by the SAGE project, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. Thank you.